everyone. It looks like everyone has joined now, so let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on how to get a win for diversity and accessibility in 2020. I'm really excited about today's presentation. Study after study has found that diversity improves business performance by 25, 35, even 45%. Also, it's a topic that's personally important to a lot of people in HR leadership today. I talked to a woman just the other day from Circle K who created the first Women's Leadership Council at Circle K's parent company. And I could just hear the passion in her voice as she was talking about this project. She even had a mission statement for the project, which is to create winning conditions for women. So our conversation today isn't focused on women specifically, but we are going to talk about how to achieve greater diversity in your organization. One of the biggest challenges with diversity is that while we all agree it's the right thing to do, the path to actually achieving your diversity goals is less clear. Fortunately, becoming accessible is a surefire way to widen your talent pool and support a more diverse workforce. So again, I'd like to say thank you for being here. I know you could be doing 100 other things right now, and you're here with us, so I really appreciate it. I hope we can provide you with a chance to think, reflect, and plan ahead in the midst of all the new year busyness. My name is Brianna Harper, and I'm your webinar host. I'm also your resource for any questions you have about today's topic. I'll be taking questions throughout the presentation, so feel free to chat in anytime during our discussion. You'll also see a follow-up email from me after the presentation with today's slide deck and a link to the recording. If you'd like to get in touch after the presentation, please reach out. You can email me at bharper@outmatch.com or find me on social at OutmatchHCM. Our two experts on the call today are Robin Stencil and Kim Carlton. Robin is our Chief Solutions Officer at Outmatch. Prior to Outmatch, Robin spent nearly 30 years in HR leadership, where she led talent management at companies like WestRock, Delta Airlines, and Macy's. All that to say, Robin has been in your shoes and has a lot of experience getting diversity initiatives off the ground and leading them to success. And speaking of shoes, Robin has an impeccable taste in shoes and is known for her very fabulous shoe collection. Hi, Robin.
Hello.
Kim is our Director of Quality Assurance and is currently leading our accessibility initiative at Outmatch. She spent the last year training, studying, and working with partners to learn accessibility inside and out. As our accessibility expert, Kim is a driving force in making our software and our company as accessible as possible. And fun fact about Kim, she makes her own sushi. I watched her do this the other day and I was very impressed. Hi, Kim.
Hi, everybody.
Before we dive into our discussion today, I'd like to give you a sneak peek at other upcoming webinars in our Future Work series. Next month, we have a special Valentine's Day edition on candidate experience and how to give candidates more love in the hiring process. Then in March, we'll show you how analytics can help you understand team dynamics and strengthen your internal mobility initiatives. And finally, in April, we'll dive into culture fit versus culture add, monocultures, and how to hire good fits but not clones. If you're interested in any of these topics, I'd love to have you back. You can register for upcoming webinars at outmatch.com/webinars. You can also watch any of our past webinars on our YouTube channel. Each presentation, as well as today's presentation, is valid for 1 professional development credit for the SHRM CP or SHRM SCP, and I'll chat in that activity code at the end of the webinar today, so keep an eye out for that. Now, back to the reason you're all here, diversity and accessibility. I just wanted to quickly go through some of the questions we're going to cover in today's discussion. Why does accessibility matter more now than ever before? What does accessibility mean, and what does it mean for HR? What's the cost of not being accessible? And what are the must-dos for HR leaders in 2020? Because everyone's accessibility journey is different, I'd like to do a quick poll to find out where you are in yours. This will help Robin and Kim understand and talk to the part of the journey that's most relevant to you. So take a moment to think about your accessibility journey, and I'm going to launch this poll for everyone. So it looks like we've got answers coming in. I'm very excited to see where everybody is. I'll give everyone just a couple more seconds to put their answer in, and then I'll share the results with everyone. All right, thank you so much for participating in the poll. It looks like most of you answered A, I know it's important and I want to learn more. Let me share these results with everyone. Okay, so 42% said, I know it's important and I want to learn more. 28% said, I'm eager to make improvements, just need budget and a plan. And 30% of you said making improvements and pursuing a fully accessible experience. So thanks again, everyone, for letting us know where you are in your journey. All right, so to kick us off, I'd like to circle back to that first question in our agenda. It makes sense that being accessible widens your talent pool and helps you retain the talent you've got, which is incredibly important in a tight talent market. But we've been in a tight talent market for years, so why is accessibility on everyone's mind now? Robin, what would you say about that?
So I think as we, and we saw this with people who said, I'm on the road, right? We're progressing with our diversity and inclusion journey. And this just becomes one more consideration for us as we work to build environments that are inclusive and allow people, our employees, candidates, and customers to belong. And quite frankly, it's something that our candidates and employees are demanding of us and our customers. And so if we don't think of this, we're not going to be able to win both in the talent marketplace, but as well as in the consumer marketplace, and really thinking about this. And I think this voice, and as we talk more about inclusion and belonging, becomes even more important. Additionally, I think it's also becoming more and more integrated into our everyday lives if we think about technology. So as we kind of think about accessibility, and Kim's going to give us some great information on this today, it's really more of what we do. And examples are, we've bought online for years now, but how we buy online is even different. I was watching a news show as I was getting ready this morning, and they talked about buying a mattress online, something a few years ago you wouldn't have thought of, because how am I going to return this, right? What does that look like? So again, even what we're buying and how we buy it has changed. On the employee side, I think what's happening is how we do our work is changing consistently. So while we've been using technology for many years, how we use it and how it's integrated into our jobs has really started to change. And as we think about it, whether it's the tools that we need to do our work, we need to make sure that they're supporting our employees and allowing them to be the most productive that they can. So this accessibility, again, becomes more important. I think a great example kind of from the employee's standpoint is thinking about onboarding. And so if you go back many years ago, right, it was sort of this in-person session that you had, and then all of us said, okay, that doesn't really work. We're becoming broader, our employees are more dispersed, and so we really want to be able to do this from a digital perspective, and we started all these tools that you could do things online. We're making even more interactive now. Maybe that's with gamification, maybe it's with augmented reality or virtual reality, and as you start to add those components in it, this accessibility becomes even more important as we start to change those. So those are just a couple of thoughts I had.
Yeah, and to kind of follow up with what Robin said, I mean, and I had to look this up, is that the web is like more than 25 years old now, right? So it's not a novelty anymore, right? I mean, these apps and these things, they run our lives now. They keep us on track, they run our lives, and I think a lot of the generation that's moving into the workforce has had this their entire life, which means their expectations are really, everyone's expectations at this point are really high on what features it has, how it delivers it, things like that. I mean, it's instrumental.
There was a session for some CHROs that I attended, and one of the things that they talked about was digitally native, right? So as we think about this becomes even more and more important. Clearly with the years of experience, although you can't see me, 100 years old, that's not sort of the generation I'm from, but I even find myself, I had left my phone, which I know is crazy to think about, at home one day. I wasn't sure how to order a cup of coffee because I only order coffee off of a Starbucks app. I didn't know how to check in for my flight because I only do that from an app. So as you start, to Kim's point, as you do this, it really starts to change how you think about things.
Yeah, I love those points, and I'm going to recap some of that for everybody so that you have this in your takeaway materials. But like Robin and Kim were both talking about, there's this huge population of digital natives, and they and all of us together have higher expectations of what technology is supposed to do. It's supposed to be there. It's supposed to work all the time, no downtime. Kim, to your point, when this was new, we were kind of excited to have something new, and it was very groundbreaking, and now it's the norm, and it's just supposed to work, and it's supposed to be there. There's also this influence of social media, and you have to have a concern about your brand reputation. So what does it say about you, if you're not accessible, if you don't have a way for all different types of people to be able to apply for your job or be successful when they get inside your company? And people are going to talk about that. If they have a bad experience, it's going to be very loud on the web. And younger generations too, there's this idea of generational differences where younger generations, they'll speak up about things like that, where maybe older generations were more go with the flow and do your job and keep your head down. I mean, that's all changing as well. And then diversity now is not just about demographics and the numbers. It's about how do you become as innovative as possible, and how do you create this culture of diverse thinking. So all of these things are shifting kind of as we speak.
I think too, just if you kind of go back to one of the points that you made, you talk about, a new generation and the expectations and the voice that they have. I think what's interesting is it's not necessarily that the voice is coming to you and saying, hey, your site's not accessible to me. Here's what it is. They're voting and they're telling their friends through social media. So back to your point on social media, if you combine those things, it becomes very powerful for you as an organization, either as a pro or a con, as you look to go back to how are you recruiting, what are your customers saying about your business, all those channels now that starts to come from.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like you said about buying mattresses, I mean, this just wasn't the way things were done a couple years ago, and now it's almost the only way that it is done is for people to share their experiences online.
So let's talk about web accessibility. Kind of what does it mean? So before we go there, let's take a step back and why is the web important? Why is all this technology important to us? And, we have an unbelievable amount of information at our fingertips, right? You can, oh, I don't know about that. Let me go search it. Let me go Google it, right? And see what's going on. If you have the ability to stay connected. So if you don't live near your family, you don't live near your friends, you now have the ability to almost feel like you're in the same room having a conversation with them, right? So a lot of those barriers are gone. And I think that's one thing about technology and we think about the web is it really removes barriers, whether it be location barriers, physical barriers, even language barriers, right? It removes all of those so we can start to have relationships and gain knowledge really across the world. So if we think about web accessibility, so you add web accessibility on top of that, and again, it's making sure those digital products are easily accessible to everyone. This is across the board, whether it's someone with a disability or possibly a person without a disability. Everyone needs the same experience. Everybody needs to be provided the same information. So I think that's one of the big things when you think about web accessibility that you're really striving for is I like to say it should be the same experience, kind of period, right? A lot of times accessibility can get confused with usability. So that's one thing where accessibility is everyone should have access and have the same information and process available to them. Usability, it's a little bit rougher. It's more how do we explain this? It's more your satisfaction, right? So let's take word processing apps, right? As an example, there's a million of them, right? You can go and you can pick the one. They all have basically the same goals, right? But you're going to find one that works better for you, that you like better. You know, maybe one crashes a lot and that's not really going to work for us, right? Or, you know, it could be anything. Usability is a little bit different because your preference really kind of drives that one a little bit more. So how do we define accessibility? So, and this is really kind of the first line of really thinking about it is whether you're designing, developing, procuring, you know, whatever you're doing here is you want to make sure that any mobile application, any digital media, any product can be used with assistive technology. So this doesn't mean you're coding assistive technology. It just means that the application you're procuring or you're developing can be used by things like, say, screen readers or Braille encoders. So there's a way that those are developed so that they can be easily used through those different technologies.
Yeah, so as we think a little bit about this, it starts to come in, what are the laws that are in place? And as a business, we think about, you know, first kind of what our customers, employees need and want. That sort of sits sort of in front of mind, hopefully for you. But we can't forget the law because it's there and it's part of what we do every day. For many of us in HR, as we think about accessibility and those things, I'm sure popping into your mind becomes ADA, Americans with Disability Act. And if we think about that, that act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment. So as we think about this and as we think about people applying, what does that mean? And so this area becomes very gray, and Kim's going to give us some more great information as we think about this and the guidelines today. Because again, I think the legality of this is not as clear cut as the ADA itself. But one thing here to highlight is the fact that it is, while it's a guideline, we believe it's becoming much along the ways that people are thinking about GDPR, right? GDPR is not required in certain countries, it is in others. What does that look like? But we're seeing it become more standard, more focused, and we start to believe that there will be more legislation around this and that there will be more constraints. So how do we get in front of this? How do we get ahead of this without suddenly something saying, oh my gosh, I have 18 months to be in compliance with the law, which for those of you who work in global companies and GDPR hit, right, we were all scrambling to figure out what does it mean, what do I need to do, what do I actually need to do, and the letter of the law. And so as we think about this, how do you start to integrate that in, and how do you start to think about that a little bit more from again, sort of the guideline, not legal side. And so Kim's going to give us some great history and think of some context as we think about this.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, if you think about the Workforce Rehabilitation Act of 1973, it wasn't really, I think, until 1998 that they added Section 508, which dealt with technology, right, and products and apps that are out there. It wasn't, and you know, that was a ways after 1973. Right, I mean, and then if you think about 1998, that was a while ago too. So if we talk next about what are the guidelines, right? So there's laws and there's guidelines, and the WCAG, which is a Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, it was first published 20 years ago, and in the industry, it was kind of a global game changer because it boiled it down a little bit to something that was really attainable and understandable. And the WCAG right now is on its third version. And as you said, it's kind of the gold standard kind of internationally out there. And it was the brainpower of two organizations, the World Wide Web Consortium and the Web Accessibility Initiative came together. And really these guidelines took, you know, we need to be accessible, and it really boiled it down for really content developers, content creators, developers and testers to really understand what that means. So they created 4 guidelines. The first one that we'll talk about is perceivable. I'll give some examples as we go so we have something to hold on to. So the first one is perceivable, and this is really your most basic level. And we'll talk about it in the form of a website because I think it's going to be easier because you know, it could be across the board. We could be talking about anything. So we'll talk about the form of a website. And the users need to be able to identify what's there and grasp the information that's being presented to them. So that means, you know, if you're a sighted user, you can read it and you can understand what's being presented to you. If you're a non-sighted user, then your website can be consumed completely by a screen reader, so it can be read out loud. And say you're a person maybe with some color sensitivities. You want to make sure that the color contrast on your site, you know, matches some guidelines that the WCAG lays out for you. And if you're like myself, who has glasses, you can zoom in, right, on the text and read the text that's in there without losing, again, context of, you know, what's being implied, you know, what's being delivered on this web page. The second one is operable, which means you need to be able to use it, right? So if it really needs to be navigatable by a mouse, you can use a mouse, right? Or your keyboard to be able to tab through it. Either way, if we think about loading a website, one of the things you want to make sure is that if you've got animations or media on there, that those can be paused, stopped, restarted, any of those things. And then really another big one for operable is it needs to be forgiving of mistakes. So cancel buttons. If you click on a hyperlink and you're like, oh, I don't really want to go there, you can drag off and you're not actually going to navigate anywhere. So just kind of being a little bit more forgiving as people are operating the website. Understandable is the third, and just because a website is perceivable and operable doesn't mean it's understandable. And that just means that on your site you want clear, concise language, directions, so people understand, especially if so you have a website and it's got a form on it or an application you're filling out, right? Mm-hmm. You really want to make sure that you've got directions on how to fill it out, the logical flows make sense, right? First name, last name, email, and you're not kind of bouncing around all over the place. And you really want good labels. And that kind of comes into play, like as you've got screen readers and things like that that may be consuming your website. You really want to have that additional context for everyone. Robust is the last one. And that one is more, we are in the digital age, so we have a lot of choices, right? So if we just got a website, what browser are you going to use to look at it, right? We've got Chrome, we've got Safari, we've got Edge. As a user of your website, I should really be able to choose which one I want to use. And same goes with assistive technologies. There's lots of options out there for different assistive technologies, and you really want your website to be consumable by most of them, so that people do have that choice as they're going through it.
Kim, as you went through those things, I mean, I started thinking about how many of those things are important. You know, you mentioned glasses. I probably should be wearing glasses most of the time. So the zoom feature, the ability of like, oh my gosh, I totally didn't mean to hit that kind of thing, all becomes important as you kind of start to think about some of these things, and as you start to look at those. How did you think about sort of the different situations in which sort of people would start to apply that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is really kind of an understanding, right? As you have people with different disabilities, really starting to understand what those are, and then what the products are that are out there that assist them in their daily lives, mm-hmm. right? And really kind of stepping into those shoes, and kind of taking it from there.
Yeah. It's just, it seems like it's a lot and kind of overwhelming, and I think this is a great way kind of breaking it down a bit as we look at some of these different types.
Yeah, definitely. So there are, different types of disabilities that you really want to design for. So we'll take, actually before we take one as an example, one of the things I want to call out is that when you think about it, is you could have a permanent disability, a temporary one, or a situational one. So we're going to stick with our example of a website, right? So say you go to a website, you're applying for a job, right? And it's got maybe an intro video in it, right? Background on the company, something like that. If we choose maybe auditory from this list, a permanent disability could be someone who's deaf, right? So in that case, they would need closed captions or a transcript to be able to consume that video. Temporary, and I get these all the time, is an ear infection, right? Which is, I can't hear as well as I normally do, so I may want closed captions or a transcript, right? Situational could be, I've started this process maybe on the subway, and it's really loud, and I can't hear, so I'm, again, going to want that additional context, the subtitles, things like that, to get me through that video. So it's always, I think that's kind of a big call out, is that it's not, there's multiple levels, right? And then as you can see here, we've got visual, physical, speech that all, kind of play a part in the different ways you need to design for.
And I think that goes back to your point about designing for everyone. Yeah. I mean, while this came about because we wanted to be accessible to people with disabilities, this is really about being accessible to everyone, like you said.
I love too that you just talked about the different ways that comes in, whether that permanent, temporary, or situational, because I think the impact of that is different to each person, but really to the person who's sitting there, it's the most important thing now, right? So if I've gone, to your point, if I'm on the subway and I've got a long commute, right, and I'm using that to apply and look for jobs or do those other things, if my experience is inhibited by that time constraint that I have becomes really important to that. So it's great to think about the fact that, again, we probably, when this first came up, I was thinking more of the permanent things, and I love how you kind of brought in the temporary and the situational as well, to think about the fact of where we are at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we look at this next slide, I mean, this was a staggering statistic as we thought about this. 1 in 5 people has a disability that affects their use of the web. And again, I think as we think about this, this is more permanent. So if you add in those situational, this starts to blow up even more. And if you think about the power of that, that means 20% of the population on a regular basis may not be buying your products, because there's something that's inhibiting them to do that. They may not be learning more about your company, or applying for jobs. And I think, as we think about this, and as I think about organizations that I've worked with, or, different friends of mine, as we've talked about this, gosh, this has got to be interesting. I've got to put a video, I've got to do all these other things, but I don't know that we've always thought about, because we think reading something can sometimes be cumbersome or boring, but we don't really think about, well, how do we make those accommodations? But when you put it in terms of, now I'm losing 20% revenue, 20%, 20% of people are buying, that's a chunk of revenue. That could be, there may not be 20%, but it would be some portion of my revenue is going out the door. It is 20% of my customer base. That's going to impact potentially my net promoter score. And then if you think about your population side of that, again, we're all struggling to find people to fill the jobs that we have, and imagine how I've just excluded a percentage of those people as well. Just, I don't know, again, when we were going through this and saw that number, it was staggering to me that it was that large. So as we think about web accessibility, I think the other thing that really should come in mind, and particularly as we tie this back to diversity and inclusion, is, are we creating an inclusive mindset? So as we as an organization go out and do things, how do we really think about inclusion? And again, this is one of those topics that we probably have a whole sidebar on, of what is inclusion. But I think today, as we think about it, expanding that, I mean, it certainly stacks from our gender and ethnicity and age, right, or some of the typical things, but thinking about inclusion from a disability standpoint. And again, as Kim pointed out, which I think is really powerful, disability not just in the permanent context, but how do we think about it in the temporary and situational context as well. I think add to that diversity of thought. So again, as people become more inclusive in how they think, which can be different, this can also impact. So again, perhaps I was talking to a friend of mine, and I'd had a bad customer experience. And I'd shared it with her, and I didn't really think anything about it at this place. And it was probably 6 months later, and we were talking about something. My assumption was she was still buying from this place. And I said something like, well, don't you go here? And she said, no, your story made me so upset, I don't buy there anymore. Wow. So think about the fact that now, if I've got a friend who can't utilize something and they share that, it's not just that 20%. That inclusive environment has grown, and now I've grown and decided, well, I'm not going to use that website either because it doesn't suit my friend. So what's the next thing? And who else is it not including? So I think it's really important as we think about that, as we think about our organizations. Additionally, Brianna, when she kicked us off, talked about the impact on there. And again, study after study shows that being inclusive is better for our business. It's better for our shareholders. It's a better return for them. It's better engagement for both our employees and better customer satisfaction, as we go on. So all of that becomes very important as we think about this. And again, this number of impact.
So some things to avoid, I think, when designing for accessibility. So this could be designing or even purchasing, procurement. If you guys are out there really looking for vendors to help you with this, is some of the big items. And these are some of the things that the WCAG lines out for you, right? This is why I think a lot of developers and testers and people in the IT field really like the guidelines, is because they actually give you things to hold on to, right? So one of the things is, avoid flashing images or text. And if you need to put text, we'll keep going with the website, right? So if you need text on your website, well, just put text. Don't put an image of text, because if you think about, again, myself with my glasses, right, and me having to zoom in on that page, if it's an image of text, it can distort, right, the higher you get in magnification. Another one that was just kind of called out in those guidelines is, background music or sounds. Maybe try and avoid them. If you have folks who are using a screen reader, then they've got sounds that start when the website loads, as well as a narration from the screen reader, which can be overwhelming or confusing. And then scrolling text, unless there's a way to stop it, because again, everyone kind of reads at different rates, could consume a web page at different rates. So, let them do the scrolling and get where they need to do. And then the big one is color. So color by itself is usually kind of never a good thing. So if we take an example as filling out our application online, is I forget to fill in my last name or my email address, something that's required. Today we always see it like highlights red, so you can tell it. But if you've got some color sensitivities, you may not see the outline in red. So it's always good to use maybe a symbol and a color, so that if, say, I had a color sensitivity, I may not see that it's red, but I may see that exclamation point that's there. And I forgot my email again, right? So let me go put that in, and then I'll continue on my way. So that's one of the good things. And if you haven't read the WCAG, it's all posted online. It's a great resource to have real world examples where you take these high level of, okay, I need my product or my application to be accessible. And I'm starting to understand some of the different ways, but what does that actually mean? Right? If you're working with a vendor, like, what questions really should I ask them as I go through this process? Or as maybe a product owner, what do I have to start talking to my development team about? Like, what are the things we have to start thinking about? And that gives you a really good framework to get started. And it gives you the answers as you go through it. So it's even better.
I loved that example that you used about filling out an application and the color, but also the symbol, because as you start to think about this, you start to think about, is the interest, right? It starts to say, is this making my website no longer interesting, right? Is it boring? But I think thinking about these things in combination really drives that interest. Is that something you've seen as you kind of gone and worked through this?
Absolutely. And accessibility and usability kind of walk really close together, right? Which is why the lines can get blurred a little bit. But with that same example, you're going through, if you're not noticing, we've all done this, where you're filling out this huge thing, right? And then it's like, you try and hit next, and it's like, something's wrong. And you're like, I don't know what it is, right? Like, it's not calling it out to me. I can't, so you've got to scroll back through everything you filled out. And it's like, okay, well, let me go, maybe it was my title, right? Or maybe it was, who knows? And that's where it's so important to make things easy, right? Accessible for everyone and easy to get through, because if not, then you're going to start to see people drop off and say, okay, I'll just try the next one, and that's where you can start to see kind of some drop down, to your point, where if it's not easy and it's not accessible, you're not going to get kind of those large volume of candidates through your process.
Right.
Yeah.
I think outlining some of these guidelines is really helpful, because while we may not have a lot of software designers or developers on the call, I mean, I imagine you guys are designing experiences for your candidates, for your employees, and that does fall in your realm. And so these are the types of things that you have to be aware of and thinking about, so that when things are designed, you're able to kind of check for X, Y, and Z, and just make sure that it's accessible to the most amount of people possible.
Yes.
I think it just goes back to, as we think about like organizations and change, and as we're updating things, certainly I've seen and working in large organizations, the more collective group that you start to bring together, right? So if you think about this, if someone's doing something from a website, even if it's a customer perspective, right, great to have maybe somebody from the HR team who's part of that to sort of have this lens to it, right? Your communications team is going to have a different lens, your marketing team, your IT team. So imagine if you kind of holistically think about this, you've got not only the interest that you're trying to create, but also how do you make it most accessible for everybody, and sort of bringing those groups together. It's a great learning experience, I think, as you go through these things, and particularly when they're new, right? Because appreciative of, the WCGA and being able to that, but like probably the density of some of that stuff, how do you get different people to be able to go through and really take components of that and bring through and kind of like learning along the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thinking about what needs to be accessible, a good place to start is to think about what's most critical to your business. So again, we've talked about a lot of things, and we've got a huge list here. These are all pretty HR centric as we think about it. And that's probably a lot of you who are on the phone, but really thinking about it. And again, thinking about being, for those of you who are HR business partners, how do you become a great business partner? Well, it's to think about what are those things that are impacting the business. So is it that really, if we think about it, the place that we've got most people landing are customers, employees, and I'll use Kim's example of the website. That might be a place to start, because you've got this coming together of two different groups. And so one of the things too is it helps lend a voice to HR when you go and partner, whether that's your marketing team or your sales team or whoever is really focused on your customer, to say, hey, here's some things we're thinking about from an employee experience. How might these be impacting you as you think about driving customers to our website? And so how do we bring that? That may not be the right thing, but again, I think about what's the most what is going to have the most impact on your business, because that's going to give you the most voice as you think about it. And again, I think it comes back to this great partnership between HR and other organizations. And so how do we kind of still play in our lanes, if you will, but also bring through this community and thinking about the business? And, I think still so often I hear HR people say, hey, how do I have a voice in the business? Well, here's a way to think about it, and think about what's important to your organization. And you're going to go through and you're going to create a whole list, right? And so then how do you prioritize what those things are? And again, not doing that in a vacuum is probably a great exercise. I think the other thing as you go through the priority piece of this is thinking about maybe considering designating someone as a champion. Who's the champion, right? You certainly need an executive sponsor, but who's the person from the day-to-day perspective that's going to do that? And do you have someone in your organization who's impacted by some of these things? And do they help challenge or help champion through that? In general, right, we talk about development all the time. This is one of those great projects that becomes a development assignment. I don't know, Kim, you kind of got this assigned to you. Do you feel developed after having gone through it?
I do. I feel like I definitely, you learn a lot, but like the learning never stops, right? So there's always something new. Like I think we were talking about the other day, like I was, listening to another podcast this weekend, right? Because it's, another one that's been released, like you're always kind of growing. And I think that's where a champion or multiple champions really within your organization can really play a huge part, is because they can start kind of spreading that education, right? Because a lot of folks, for good or bad, it's, they may not be thinking about it yet. Like we've talked a lot about websites and apps and, things you may be building or procuring, but there's other things out there too, like the PowerPoint I just created or the marketing materials I'm about to distribute. Like accessibility drops even into, those are still digital artifacts, but they drop down lower into really all aspects of the business. So having folks there to kind of guide that education through the rest of the organization and bring it to the forefront of everyone. So as they're starting to make decisions or start projects, accessibility is really one of the things that always gets talked about. It's
Yeah.
not an after. It doesn't come at the end. You really want to weave it into the beginning and throughout the whole process.
You know, as you kind of talked about some of those things, just as thinking about when you said PowerPoint and thinking about where to start, right? What a great and sort of simple way to start the conversation.
Yeah.
What does that look like, you know? And I think we've all been in those meetings where one of two things happens, right? There's a looks beautiful, but no one can read the font that's on there from the back of the room, and so everybody starts walking to the front, or the font size, right? It's because we've decided to put every piece of content on there. So how are we looking at that and start? It's a really simple way to start to think about that as an organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is a question that came up as we were preparing for this webinar, which is, well, if everything needs to be accessible, everything your candidates and your employees will ever touch in your organization, it becomes really massive and really overwhelming. And I think the takeaway here is that baby steps are good. Baby steps are better than nothing. So as long as you're going in the right direction, you're on the right track.
Yeah.
So the cost of not being accessible, I mean, we've got several things up here, and as you can see from this slide in the conversation, this cost really impacts your organization financially. So again, if I think about this, if I'm not getting customers driving towards my products or things like that, then that's a financial component. It's also a financial component to not filling your jobs, right? If we think about this in critical jobs, if you can't, if you, example, in a manufacturing environment, if you're not filling jobs, you may not be running a line, which means you may not be up to full production. If you're not up to full production, then that's got a revenue impact, right? So that cost, and we talk, you know, constantly in HR, the cost of not filling a job and what does that look like? And so I think that becomes important to you. So how do you maximize your revenue? From a brand perspective, again, that's to our customers, it's to our employees, it's to our candidates, and really thinking about that accessibility, although not overtly with a big flashing sign says, I care, it shows you care, right? Because you're thinking about how easy, really what you're thinking about, how easy was this to use? Gosh, that application process was really simple. I didn't have to go back. I'm looking for a job. I've applied for 15 jobs today. And really this one was very easy. If I get 15 calls, how am I going to prioritize that, right? What does that look like? What does that think about as you look at it? And I think, you know, still thinking about the whole, you know, kind of whole as you think about the brand, that bleeds into your culture though, right? And so is that divisive, that part about being an inclusive culture? Are you creating belonging? And again, that culture is internally with your organization, but it's also, do you create a culture of belonging where your customers feel like they belong, right? This need to kind of create an experiences both for our employees and our customers, and we want belonging as we go through that experience and we come there. And candidates, I mean, I think the greatest thing is to have candidates walk away and say, really disappointed I didn't get that job, but man, that's a great company. I'm going to go tell somebody else and have that good story. I talked about my story of saying too, and again, I didn't post this on social media. I just said to a friend, wow, I'm not doing business with this company anymore. And that was a choice she made. Imagine if my anger had hit the point of, I'm going to type this on social media. What does that do? So again, how do you kind of create that piece of it? And again, then from a legal perspective, and again, today, while there are some legal components to this as we think about ADA, I think we see more of this coming. And so how do you kind of just sort of knock that out of the picture and really focus, again, I think if you think about growing your organization and what's important, you know, really we want to focus more on culture, brand, financial. Those become sort of more interesting components than to have to kind of think about what is it that I have to do from a legal perspective.
Yeah, and I really like that you brought culture into the conversation. Because it's the showpiece. You know, you can talk all day about diversity being important to your company, but this is really one way to show, to prove that you're putting in some effort there.
Absolutely, and I think as people are looking for new opportunities, and we take this back to hiring, right? It's the good stories that really kind of will engage other people to be like, hey, you know, whether I work for this company and this is what our culture is like, and hey, look, we have these open positions, or even down to, yeah, I applied for this job and it was even just I may not have gotten the job, but it was an amazing experience going through the application process, the interview process, getting to know folks, kind of having a nice cohesive process, and then turn and say, hey, I didn't get the job, but hey, go check them out, right? And even though you didn't get it, you're still kind of sending that good story along. We've all got enough bad stories,
Right.
but to keep sending those good stories.
And I think to that point, I mean, I think if we think about from a talent acquisition perspective, right, we still kind of think, and I mean, I use the example of going on and applying for jobs. I think really for a lot of us, we're struggling to get people to apply for our jobs. So what are those barriers when you finally go out, and if you think about if you are in the recruiting field, or even if you know someone is, I've gone out, I've worked really hard, I've spent my time cultivating a relationship with Kim to get her interested in my organization because that's the person I really want. And then I say to her, great, we're so excited to have you, you know, that you're considering us. If you don't mind just filling out this application or doing something, going to our website and checking this out. If she goes to that after all of that effort and now she's not able to access it in a way that feels good, she's looking for reasons to screen me out. I'm looking for reasons to screen her in. And so how do we really make sure, again, those passive candidates and become really interested in us and sort of see the value in that?
So I'd love for everyone on the call to take a moment to type in any questions that you have and why you're thinking about what you'd want to ask of Robin and Kim. This is a question, you know, that I had, which is how do you measure accessibility, or how do you even find out how well you're doing? You know, because this is a journey. How do you know where you are in the journey?
I think the big call out again is it's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't stop either. It's not like you can be like, oh, I'm completely accessible now, right? Because our process changes, our applications that we're using as part of the process change, things like that. So it's super ongoing. So I think kind of measuring it in small pieces and really kind of looking for, as say you're starting your project, right? And you're like, okay, and again, we're back to, oh my gosh, where do I start, right? Is pick the ones that have the most impact, right? So if you think about your hiring process, maybe it is the application portion of it as a place to start, because then you get folks through the door, but then also measuring it to make sure, how's my whole journey, right? From I step through at the application process to the end, the interviews, the acceptance letters, hopefully, right? And then even into everyday life at work. And really start is put a nice Candyland roadmap up there for yourself, as a way to envision it, and and step your way through and start kind of, checking off areas that you've really had a chance to address.
Think about it. You've got your employees, you've got your customers. Why not start asking for some feedback, right? If you're making these small changes, going back to those people that that are being impacted, what are they saying? What's the feedback that's coming back to you? If we think about, again, I'll kind of stick with, since we started with the website journey, let's just continue on, right? You've got measures and metrics that you look at for click-through and things like that. Is that increasing? Is it staying the same? Is it decreasing, right? There may be other factors. It's not a sole one, but it's certainly an influencer as you think about some of those things and what's looking, particularly if you've gone through and tried to do all this work and suddenly if you're not seeing the same traction, what's happened along the way is probably a question to ask yourself. But again, really using those channels that you have as you go through. And I think it's great, some organizations have employee resource groups. And so you might have one of them in particular think about this might be something they're passionate about. Again, thinking about ways, how do you make this interesting? Well, how do you engage other people? How do you connect? How do you, again, look for different ways around development opportunities for people to think about? That could be a great one.
And then there's also vendors out there that will go in and help you start this process, help you through this process, where their lives are accessibility, right? So they can go in and take a look at your application, or take a look at the website that you have, and they can start to say, hey, here are the places you're doing great, right, and keep doing these things, but hey, here are some things that you need to address, and they really kind of guide you through that process. And those companies are out there, and they're great because they really help you. If you don't know where to start and you need someone to help walk you through the process, they get you up, they get you educated, and they will get you moving on your journey.
And I really like what you said about you're never really done.
Yeah.
I mean, just thinking about some of the disabilities we talked about and the temporary situations and the permanent situations. I mean, it starts with kind of widening your perspective, because a lot of this is invisible to someone that doesn't have that sort of challenge. So you're not seeing it. You're going to make some accessibility changes, enhancements, and your website's probably not going to look any different. And this is where you really engage people or groups, even get feedback on how well you're doing, because it may not be obvious, and you're not really going to get to an end that says we're 100%, we did a great job, now we can move on to something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I wanted to quickly go through some of the questions that are asked of us, because I think this is really helpful as you think about engaging with your own partner or your own vendor partners. Because there's no clear cut, I am X% accessible, I've done a great job, I'm certified in something. You have to find another way to get that information. So I just threw up a couple questions that we get asked. What have you done towards accessibility? Can you show me your progress, and what are you working on? So I just wanted to share that with everybody so that you have a starting point for some of the questions that you can ask of your own vendors.
And I think that's important, right, is that you're asking those questions and really understanding where this fits into the vendor perspective, right, as you're going through it. Just, I mean, for those of you who are in the land of RFPs and doing those, I know there's probably already a lot of questions that you're sorting through and kind of consolidating, but this becomes really important, I think, as we think about that.
Yeah,
it does. And it goes back to the journey, because if you've got vendors, or say you're doing a vendor selection, right, and you ask those questions of everyone, I think what's most important is that you're finding the vendors, no matter where they are on their journey, they're on that journey, right? And they've started it. So, and then they'll, they love to talk about it, right? So they'll talk about where they are and what they've done so far and maybe what's coming next, because again, it doesn't end, right? So making sure your vendors out there or people you're selecting to kind of help you work you through are kind of just as passionate about accessibility as you are.
Yeah. It looks like we've got a couple questions coming in, so get those questions in. I want to quickly share a client story of ours. Because accessibility is very focused on making sure that the technology you're using doesn't create barriers to candidates or employees in your company, I think it's also important to talk about how technology can improve diversity beyond being accessible or WCAG compliant. So you have this goal that you want to be at, this kind of threshold for making sure that people have access, but then is there a world beyond that where you can not just give people access, but actually really improve some of those numbers? So here's a great example from a client of ours. They're a really large BPO that provides customer engagement services to some of the biggest retail, financial services, healthcare, and tech brands in the world. They started using our pre-hire assessment in their call centers to help identify and fast-track top talent in their applicant pool. And they saw improvements in quality of hire, which is what they expected, but the coolest part was that they also saw an increase in diversity. My favorite stat from their data, before implementing our assessment, 20% of the company's hires were African American, and a year later, African American hires had increased to 35%. During that year, our assessment helped them hire teams, or helped their hiring teams ignore factors like race that aren't related to job success, and instead see an objective apples to apples view of each candidate. What I really love about this story is it didn't take a big, expensive, multi-year initiative to achieve greater diversity. It was just an objective piece of software that they implemented in their hiring process. So I just wanted to share that story so that everyone can think about, other ways to improve diversity after you start or continue to move through your accessibility journey.
I think if we tie that kind of story back to accessibility and you think about this, there's sort of these, probably perhaps, right? There's some unconscious bias that sort of gets eliminated as you go through this process. And I think that's sort of the same thing as we think about accessibility. So if I'm interested in your organization, if we've gone this way, and I'll go back to the part of Kim and I've been having this conversation and I'm trying to get her to come to my organization and she's kind of now starts to become a little bit in, if she's now got to come to me and say, hey, this is great, but I can't access your website or I can't fill out your application. I've got some of these things. And again, those are things that maybe I would not have known about her. Do those things start to come in and become a bit of unconscious bias is what you start to worry about from that perspective. And so being able to have some data and tools that allow you to kind of eliminate that or to be able to have the right setup really helps as you kind of start to go through it. So I like kind of this story, while not kind of around accessibility, can certainly go back to the topic of today too.
Yeah. So I've got a question here. When using apps like Facebook, Snapchat, and TikTok to recruit millennials, how can we make sure we're being accessible friendly?
So I think most on Facebook, all those guys, they're well on their way on their accessibility journey. I assume, right? They're large enough. So really just kind of, there's a couple things you can do. There are tools out there where you can say load up Facebook and take a look at it, and it looks at it real quick and says, oh, these things are done well, these things may not be done well. There's things you can do yourself. Say we'll just keep talking about Facebook, right? But Facebook, you can load it up on your mobile app, or on your mobile phone. All your mobile phones have built-in screen readers on them, so you can actually just turn the screen reader on and let it read through the page, and you just kind of step back and listen, right? And a lot of times I have to turn away. I have to turn away from what I'm looking at and just listen. And does it make sense? Can someone navigate through it? So there's some things you can do yourself to kind of take a look at it, but really reach out to these companies. A lot of them they blog their way through these journeys as well, so other folks can learn from them. But reach out, talk about it, start those conversations, because those are the conversations we really want to get started.
So is it fair then to say, as you're going through and buying these tools to utilize for, right, because there's all some cost to some of this usually, but that you could ask your sales rep or whomever, please talk to us about your accessibility journey?
Absolutely.
I think that's really helpful, and that goes back to your Candyland journey a little bit, which some of this is just walking through it yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we talk about that a lot in terms of candidate experience, but really through the lens of accessibility kind of brings new life to it. We're right at time, and I wanted to let everybody know that I chatted in the SHRM activity ID so that you can use that code to go get your professional development credit. Any last thoughts from you, Kim, and Robin? Maybe like a 20-second takeaway for everyone on the call today.
Okay, I'll go first. So I think a lot of people were just at the beginning of their journey, right? So the first thing is don't get overwhelmed. There's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of folks who have already started their journeys, and they love to talk about it, like we do here. And so don't hesitate to reach out for help. Don't be afraid to get started. And just remember, small changes every day are going to lead up to these big changes and these big improvements to ensure that your process is more inclusive. So it's kind of one of those things that just start and just keep going on that journey.
Yeah, I love that.
I was going to say be patient, I think, on that. And use the community that you've got available to you. So again, I mean, thinking about your organization, your customers, those friends that you have, how do you help include them in the process to really provide you that feedback is a way I'd say thinking about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Robin.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kim. This was really helpful. I hope everybody on the call got a lot of value out of our discussion today. I hope to see everyone back next month for the Future of Work webinar series. Thank you.